What's up, world? I'm Cameron McKinney, and this is Pop Culture Spotlight, a podcast about the movie MaXXXine. Here's a quick synopsis. Porn star MaXXXine Minx has finally caught her big break being cast in a legitimate movie. The problem? A serial killer wants to force her to confront her past. The film stars Mia Goth, Elizabeth Debicki, Michelle Monaghan, Halsey, Lily Collins, Moses Sumney, Bobby Cannavale, Giancarlo Esposito, and Kevin Bacon. Standout performances. This trilogy that consists of X, Pearl, and MaXXXine has made Mia Goth the scream queen of the moment. It's a showcase of her abilities as an actress. In it, she plays two roles, Pearl and MaXXXine, and one of the reasons I believe her performance has hit the zeitgeist is because she's brilliantly portrayed someone who is seeking fame. And yes, that's always been around, but it's now more prevalent. There's a huge amount of people who believed Goth should have gotten an Oscar nomination for Pearl, and it's hard to argue. In MaXXXine is trying to move on from the events of X, but she's dealing with real PTSD. Goth is going to continue to work in the horror genre as her next film is Frankenstein, written and directed by Guillermo del Toro, co-starring Oscar Isaac, Jacob Elordi, and Christoph Waltz. I've been a fan of actress Elizabeth Debicki since seeing her in Guy Ritchie's Man from U.N.C.L.E., and in the time since, she's impressed in Steve McQueen's Widows and Christopher Nolan's Tenet. In MaXXXine, she plays Elizabeth Bender, the director of the movie MaXXXine has been hired to work on. Debicki is given some great dialogue in the film. She is a self-proclaimed ruthless person who is career-driven and cares deeply about the art of movie making. It's one of the best performances of Debicki's career. Also in MaXXXine is Michelle Monaghan, an actress who I think is underrated. Her early films Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and Gone Baby Gone are two of my favorites, and she's great in both of them, especially the final scene of Gone Baby Gone. She's also great in the first season of True Detective. In MaXXXine, she herself is playing a detective trying to find a serial killer and really trying to help MaXXXine out. That's been one of the best things about this trilogy to me, is the use of actresses. I loved X and how it used rising star Jenna Ortega and had the best performance of actress Brittany Snow's career, and then of course you also had Mia Goth. And finally, Kevin Bacon has given two performances this year in MaXXXine and Beverly Hills Cop Axel F that remind me of his work in the 90s, where he was playing sleazy characters in movies like The River Wild and Wild Things. Bacon really is good at playing a dirtbag, and that's what he is in MaXXXine, where he plays a private eye hired by a mysterious figure to find MaXXXine. Now, I won't spoil who that figure is. One of the biggest reasons I was excited for this third movie of the trilogy is because of the star-studded cast. I was amazed that this small indie horror franchise was able to attract the likes of a Kevin Bacon, Elizabeth Debicki. Lily Collins has a big scene in this movie as well. These are legitimate stars that these kind of indie horror films usually don't attract. Big names are in this movie. Halsey is in this movie. Giancarlo Esposito, who crushed it in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Even Bobby Cannavale is a bit of a big name. Mia Goth is not the only big name to emerge from this horror franchise. The other is writer-director Ty West, who is both commenting on the horror movies and also paying homage to them as well. I love how stylistically each movie is different than the last. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Horror is like sci-fi in that so many great directors come out of the horror genre because they emerge, they have fully visions, they are allowed to make the movies they want to make, and they're also allowed to be financially successful because there's usually a creature in the movie or a slasher film that people want to see. I mean, think of the horror filmmakers that have emerged over the last decade: Jordan Peele, Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, and now you can add Ty West to that list. He is a promising filmmaker that's going to have a very good career. Here's what the director told Lou Thomas of BFI about his leading actress Mia Goth. Quote, "She's a very fearless performer. She wants the challenge, the messiness and the blurred lines and the complicated emotional stakes that go into throwing yourself into a character. She really embraces performances and the art form in that way. And because of that, you get a very unpredictable performance from her. There are many other people that are really talented, but they don't do it like that. She would probably say I owe nothing to her, but in my mind, without that connection, there's no chance that I have a career." End quote. So here's the thing. The first two installments of this horror franchise, X and Pearl, were massive critical hits. Both have scores in the mid-90s on Rotten Tomato, and I know that means nothing, but it does show that this franchise was a critical darling. Movie critics loved both X and Pearl, and they didn't seem to love MaXXXine as much. I mean, it has a 72% score on Rotten Tomatoes, which is still respectable, but I heard a lot of movie critics on Twitter tweet that they did not like this movie whatsoever, and I was surprised by that backlash given the hype around this franchise. And I don't know what it is, but most people have the biggest issue with the third films of a trilogy, and you can go to massive blockbusters, Spider-Man 3, X-Men The Last Stand. Those are superhero movies, but the same rules apply. Critics loved the first two films of those franchises, then the third one came out and it was like, whoa, slow your roll, this isn't very good anymore. And that kind of feels like the critical reaction to MaXXXine is a similar thing. People still love X, they still love Pearl, but a lot of people said this isn't what they expected when it came to MaXXXine. And as somebody who has watched all three films, I really don't understand what they're upset by. I liked the pacing of the film. I thought the film was as visually compelling as the first two films. Now, I think X is a far better film than MaXXXine, but MaXXXine is more than an adequate final installment of this horror trilogy. I liked how the movie recreates 1985 without throwing it in your face, and you know what I'm talking about. When a movie tries to recreate the 90s and just have a blockbuster in there, or when they try to recreate the 80s just with the music. No, this movie was able to recreate 1985 without it being distracting. And this is what a third film of a trilogy needs to do. It needs to be its own movie, but still feel connected to the first film. And that's exactly what MaXXXine does. There is still a connection to X. You still feel like this is that same character and she's still dealing with that trauma in her own way. What I think became of these movies after X was an expectation of what Mia Goth was going to do in each of the films. She was great in X, then she took it to another level in Pearl. I do believe that is a great performance, and I wouldn't have been mad if that performance got her an Oscar nomination. But then I think the expectations for her specifically got so high in MaXXXine, and she's not as good in MaXXXine as she was as Pearl, but she's playing a different character. She's playing the character that she played in X. And I don't think it's blasphemous to say that she doesn't give the best performance in the movie. To me, that honor goes to Elizabeth Debicki. So if you view this franchise as a showcase for Mia Goth, then I guess I could see some frustration when it comes to MaXXXine, because yes, I do believe she gives a very good performance in the film MaXXXine, but I don't think it is as good as in Pearl. So on one hand, MaXXXine kind of loses the love of the critics, but then it gains the notoriety when it comes to the box office, because MaXXXine made over $20 million, the highest of the series, and that's a respectable number. But based on how much talk there is for these movies online, you would think that they were bigger. I mean, it just seems like some horror movies that you've never heard of come out of nowhere and make over $60 million at the box office. I don't know what's going on with these movies. Again, they were critical darlings. It felt like the online and movie critics were talking about it all of the time. I just thought that it was getting more and more popular, that by the time MaXXXine came out, I thought it was going to be like one of the surprise hits of the year. Mia Goth is becoming a bigger and bigger name. They got the big names in Elizabeth Debicki, Michelle Monaghan, Kevin Bacon. A24 is starting to have more and more financial success with their movies. Civil War was their highest grossing movie ever, and it came out this year. So I thought that MaXXXine was going to have a bigger box office spectacle than it did. I would have expected like a $50 million total for this movie, but for some reason it hasn't gone there. But again, you just read all of the online comments about it and you think it's one of the most popular franchises going today. This is kind of what I'm talking about. Barbarian came out in 2022 without a major movie star, maybe other than Bill Skarsgård, and that movie made $45 million. Yet now we have X, we have Pearl. I thought we were building towards a bigger box office success for MaXXXine, and it just didn't happen. Was it because of the word of mouth that this movie isn't very good? I don't know why. I thought this movie was going to do better at the box office. Maybe I was foolish all along. Maybe it making $20 million is a success story. And some of that must have to do with how little space there is between films. I mean, X and Pearl both came out in 2022, and then MaXXXine comes out in 2024. That's 3 movies in 2 years. This really is like the movie lover's horror franchise. I mean, you really have to be in it to even understand that this trilogy exists. I bet there are people out there that have seen X, have seen Pearl, and seen MaXXXine, and don't understand that all 3 films are connected. I'm sure those people exist. And because these films have come out back to back to back, you just don't know how to feel about the final product. I hear all of these people downplaying MaXXXine like it's the weakest film of the franchise. I mean, the franchise has only been here for 2 years. Can we give it time? I have only seen MaXXXine once. Yes, right now I do view it as the 3rd film of the franchise. I liked X and I liked Pearl more than I like MaXXXine, but give it time. I mean, maybe in 10 years, I'm going to feel different about it. And again, I'm kind of just going off of the online consensus of these movies, and we know that to be false. Again, based on how many people were talking about these films online, I would have thought that they were becoming more and more popular. X made $15 million at the box office. Pearl made $10 million at the box office, and then MaXXXine makes $20 million at the box office. That's a success story. I don't think these movies cost a lot of money, but all the talk around Mia Goth and how she should have an Oscar for this performance, I just would have thought that that would have amounted to more people seeing this movie when it came into theaters, and especially because of the newfound star power that MaXXXine has. This is the movie I thought that was going to hit the mainstream, and the only people I see talking about it are the same people that were talking about X and the same people that were talking about Pearl. Having said all that, I still view these movies as a massive success story because now I think more people know the name Ty West. More people will see his next horror film or whatever next movie he ends up making. And Mia Goth has definitely become a bigger name. She was once attached to be in the next Blade movie for Marvel. Who knows if that will ever happen? But these movies definitely got her that Frankenstein job with Guillermo del Toro. I mean, these movies have been taken seriously by people. And one of the things I particularly loved about MaXXXine was its own commentary on the horror genre. There's one scene where a character played by Halsey tells Mia Goth's MaXXXine that she's not going to become famous being the star of a horror movie. And that's a comment on how we've always kind of downplayed horror. I know that horror has made stars out of a lot of people. Jamie Lee Curtis, they have become stars because of horror movies. But if you look at the grand scale of Oscars, they have not been recognized as much. I, for one, think Elizabeth Moss should have been nominated for The Invisible Man. I think Florence Pugh should have been nominated for Midsommar, and I definitely believe Lupita Nyong'o should have been nominated for Us. I'd also throw in Emily Blunt in A Quiet Place. I mean, there have been so many great performances by actresses in horror movies that have not been recognized by the Academy, and now a lot of people are adding Mia Goth to that list, and rightfully so. I mean, what would it take for a performance in a horror film to get an Oscar nomination? I mean, yes, you get a nomination every once in a while, Daniel Kaluuya for Get Out, but then they ignore an incredible performance like Toni Collette in Hereditary. And I think this is really going to be brought up again when Mia Goth gets an Oscar nomination for a far lesser performance. That's when people are going to look back and go, how did you not give her an Oscar nomination for X, Pearl, or MaXXXine? That's when people are going to shake their heads, because you know she's going to get an Oscar nomination in some weird period piece movie that not a lot of people like. I think an interesting debate is the best horror film from A24 in the X franchise. Is it X? Is it MaXXXine? Is it Pearl? I think the answer is no, although I think that X can make a strong case. If you think that X is the best horror film made by A24, I have nothing against you. I think the winner is The Lighthouse from Robert Eggers. Now, I know that might not be a straightforward horror movie. It might not be the scariest movie of all time, but it is the best horror film made by A24. Robert Pattinson is giving one of the best performances of his career, and so is Willem Dafoe. Again, a movie that was overlooked by the Oscars. The only Academy Award nomination The Lighthouse got was for its cinematography. Now that, as we all know, was well earned. I don't know if horror fans would say that 2024 has been a great year for the genre. I know a lot of people, like I've been saying, have been disappointed with MaXXXine. Abigail came and went. I didn't hear a lot of chatter about that movie. I haven't even seen that movie. That was a movie that I was anticipating and still want to see, yet I barely hear anyone ever talk about it. Longlegs seems to be the horror film, the one that stars Nicolas Cage and Micah Monroe, that everyone is talking about. That might be really scary from the sound of it. The horror film that I'm personally waiting for again comes from Robert Eggers. It's Nosferatu. I think if that movie works, that could be the hit of his career, and that could end up being the horror film of 2024, which I think we're still waiting for. I don't think there has been a universally beloved horror film. I don't want to jinx it, but I also believe that that could be the horror movie that has Oscar potential. Getting back to MaXXXine, I really do wonder if this is the last film of the X franchise. Will we ever see Mia Goth play Pearl or MaXXXine ever again? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's going to depend on what Ty West does next. If he can have success making other movies, then he'll probably continue to do that. But if he has a failure, then I would expect him to go back to the thing that was super successful. I mean, why wouldn't you? I also think you're just going to see Mia Goth appear in bigger and bigger studio movies. Like, I think somebody is going to want to make a horror film with her that is a bigger studio movie with a bigger budget that gets bigger eyeballs. And maybe they pick Ty West to be the director of that, but it won't be in the X franchise. I personally thought that MaXXXine was a high note to go out on. I thought it was super well made. I thought Mia Goth was really good. Elizabeth Debicki was brilliant. It was another showcase of what Ty West is capable of as a writer-director. And one of the greatest directors of all time, Martin Scorsese, is a super fan of the X trilogy. Here's what the legendary director said about the trilogy in the New York Times, quote, "X is the slasher era of the 1970s, Pearl 50s melodrama in vivid saturated color, and MaXXXine is 80s Hollywood rancid desperate." And he also said that they are 3 linked stories set within 3 different moments in movie culture, reflecting back on the greater culture. It's worth noting that Scorsese has also become a super fan of Ari Aster over the years. Like, he really respects these new horror filmmakers, these auteurs, if you will. I don't know what the overall legacy of these movies are going to be. All I know is that I have really enjoyed watching them. I think they are free of the better horror films of the last decade, especially X. I think it's right up there. If I had to name my top 10 favorite horror films of all time, I think X would make the list. And again, I'll reiterate it. I don't really understand everyone's disappointment about MaXXXine. It's about what I expected it to be, with a few surprises. I did not expect Elizabeth Debicki to be this good in this movie. And I probably should have seen it coming, because she is a brilliant actress. actress. And finally, would anyone be surprised if this ends up being the career-defining work of Mia Goth's career? It's going to be tough to top her work in these 3 movies, especially Pearl. Thanks for listening to this edition of Pop Culture Spotlight. I'm Cameron McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Thursday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I highly recommend you check out the movie MaXXXine. Next week on the podcast, it's a big one. I'm talking about the movie Alien Romulus starring Kaylee Spaney, so tune into that and please rate, review, and subscribe.